Sometimes, the person crying in silence is carrying a promise too heavy for one heart to keep. The rain had settled over Manhattan like a soft gray curtain, turning every streetlight into a blurry halo that shimmered across the wet sidewalks. Most people hurried past with their umbrellas tilted low, eyes fixed on somewhere warmer, somewhere brighter, somewhere that mattered more than a stranger. Ethan Carter had spent the last 12 hours inside a glass tower overlooking the city he supposedly owned. Billion-dollar negotiations, endless congratulations, another headline calling him the man who never lost. Yet as his black SUV rolled through the quiet streets, all he could think about was how strangely empty success sounded when there was no one waiting to celebrate it with him. "Pull over," he suddenly said. His driver glanced into the mirror. "Sir? Please. Right here." The SUV eased to the curb beside a small cemetery tucked between towering office buildings and old brick churches that somehow refused to disappear beneath the skyline. Ethan wasn't even sure why he had spoken. Something had caught his eye through the rain-covered window. Beneath an ancient oak tree, beside a modest stone marker decorated with fresh white lilies, a young woman knelt alone. She wasn't making a scene. She wasn't asking anyone for help. She simply sat there, shoulders trembling ever so slightly, holding a weathered wooden box against her chest as though it contained the last pieces of her world. Rain soaked her light brown hair until it clung to her face. Her pale blue sweater was far too thin for the chilly evening, but she didn't seem to notice. Ethan stepped from the warmth of the SUV before his driver could stop him. The cold air wrapped around him instantly, carrying the scent of wet earth and spring flowers. He walked slowly across the narrow stone path, careful not to intrude, yet unable to ignore what he was seeing. As he drew closer, he noticed something that unsettled him more than tears ever could. The young woman wasn't crying loudly. There were no dramatic sobs, no desperate gestures. Tears simply rolled down her cheeks in complete silence, as if she had cried so much that even grief had grown exhausted. Ethan stopped several feet away. "Excuse me," he said gently. She startled, quickly brushing her face with the sleeve of her sweater before forcing an embarrassed smile. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I didn't realize anyone was here." "You don't have to apologize." She looked away toward the small gravestone. "People usually leave when they see someone crying." Ethan gave a faint smile. "Maybe they don't know what to say." "Do you?" she asked quietly. He considered the question longer than expected. After all the interviews, speeches, and board meetings, he realized he had never actually learned how to answer someone whose heart was breaking. Finally, he shook his head. "No. But I can listen." The woman stared at the wooden box resting in her lap, her fingers tightening around its worn edges. "Listening might make things worse. Sometimes carrying it alone does that first." She closed her eyes for a moment before letting out a slow breath that seemed to carry years of exhaustion. "I'm Grace," she said. "Ethan." She nodded politely, clearly unaware that newspapers had printed his face countless times. To her, he was only another stranger standing in the rain. Then, almost as if speaking to herself instead of him, she looked back at the gravestone and whispered the words that would quietly change everything Ethan believed about success, love, and the life he had built. "I'm sorry," she said through trembling lips. "I promised I'd finish your dream, and I think I've failed you." Grace remained still, her eyes fixed on the simple granite marker as the rain softened into a gentle drizzle. Ethan did not rush to fill the silence. Somehow it felt sacred, as though every word spoken here had to earn its place. After nearly a minute, Grace carefully brushed a few drops of water from the weathered wooden box resting in her lap. The corners were worn smooth, and a tiny brass latch held it shut. It had clearly been opened thousands of times. "Everyone thinks I am crying because I lost someone," she said quietly. "But that is only part of it." Ethan listened without interrupting. "The hardest part is believing I might lose the last promise I ever made." She slowly opened the box. Inside were only 4 things. A faded photograph of an older man smiling beside a tiny neighborhood art studio. A silver bracelet with delicate hand-engraved initials. An old brass key attached to a blue ribbon. And a folded letter whose edges had turned yellow with age. Ethan expected something valuable. Instead, he saw memories that could never be replaced. Grace picked up the photograph first. His name was Walter Hayes. Most people in the neighborhood barely knew him. They thought he was just another retired teacher who spent his afternoons painting. Her fingers gently traced the smiling face in the picture. When I was 12 years old, my mother worked 2 jobs. She could not afford art lessons, but every Saturday Mr. Hayes opened his little studio and taught children for free. He always said talent should never depend on money. Ethan found himself smiling without realizing it. He sounds like someone I wish I had met. Grace nodded. So do I. Every child who walked into that little studio believed they mattered. It did not matter if they wore expensive shoes or hand-me-downs. He treated everyone exactly the same. Her smile slowly faded. Then the building was sold. The studio closed. Everyone moved on. Ethan looked toward the gravestone. Except you. She shook her head. I promised him I would reopen it someday. Not the exact building. Just a place where children could discover they were enough before the world convinced them they were not. She laughed softly through her tears. It sounded possible when I was 18. At 27 it feels impossible. Ethan glanced at the old brass key. Is that the key to the studio? It used to be. She turned it over in her palm. He gave it to me on the last day. He said, one day this key will open another door. The words lingered between them. Ethan had spent years collecting keys to private elevators, executive offices, and luxury homes, yet none of them had ever carried that kind of meaning. What happened? He asked carefully. Grace lowered her eyes. Medical bills took everything my family had. Then my mother became sick. Every dollar I earned went toward taking care of her until she passed away last winter. I teach art classes at the community center whenever they have room for me, but it barely covers rent. She swallowed before continuing. I kept telling myself I would save enough to honor my promise. Every month something happened. Another bill. Another setback. Another reason to wait. She folded the letter carefully and placed it back inside the box. Today would have been Mr. Hayes' 75th birthday. I came here because I needed to admit that I do not think I can do it anymore. Ethan looked at the wooden box one more time. It contained no fortune, no hidden inheritance, no legal document waiting to transform her future. It held something far more powerful. It held hope that refused to disappear, even after years of disappointment. For reasons he could not yet explain, he suddenly realized that this quiet promise inside a rain-soaked cemetery felt far more important than every business victory waiting for him downtown. The rain had almost stopped by the time Grace closed the wooden box and secured the tiny brass latch with careful hands, as though she were protecting something far more fragile than old keepsakes. Ethan remained beside her, unexpectedly reluctant to leave. His phone vibrated inside his coat pocket for what felt like the 10th time in 15 minutes. Another board member. Another assistant. Another reminder that tomorrow morning the financial news would celebrate the record-breaking acquisition his company had completed only hours earlier. He reached into his pocket, silenced the call without looking at the screen, and slipped the phone away again. Grace noticed the gesture but said nothing. She simply smiled faintly. Someone important must be looking for you. Ethan looked toward the glowing skyline rising beyond the cemetery gates. They can wait. She laughed softly, the sound almost surprising even to herself. Most people say that about strangers only in movies. Maybe real life needs more of that. They walked slowly toward the narrow exit path together. Small puddles reflected the evening sky while the scent of fresh rain lingered in the cool spring air. Just beyond the iron gate stood a modest brick building with a weathered sign that read Community Arts Center. Its windows were dark except for one small light glowing in the back room. Grace stopped walking. That is where I teach whenever they call me. Ethan studied the aging building. Paint peeled from the window frames, and several flower boxes sat empty beneath cracked glass. Do you teach every day? She shook her head. Only when they have enough funding to keep classes open. Sometimes once a week. Sometimes not at all. And the children? They keep asking when the next class is. Her voice softened. I never know what to tell them. Ethan followed her gaze toward the quiet building. He suddenly remembered something from his own childhood. Before private schools, before family wealth multiplied beyond imagination, before endless meetings filled every calendar square, there had been one afternoon when his elementary art teacher had taped a simple watercolor painting onto the classroom wall. She had smiled and said, "You see the world differently, Ethan. Never lose that." He had not touched a paintbrush in nearly 30 years. Somewhere along the climb toward success, that curious little boy had quietly disappeared. What are you thinking? Grace asked. Ethan smiled to himself. That I used to love painting. Her eyebrows lifted with genuine surprise. Really? Really? What happened? He let out a slow breath. Life became efficient. Art did not fit into spreadsheets. Grace looked at him for a long moment before saying, maybe it was never supposed to. Those words landed with unexpected weight. She had no idea she was speaking to one of the wealthiest men in the city. She did not know he owned companies, private jets, or luxury homes. She simply saw another person who had misplaced an important piece of himself. A chilly breeze swept through the street, and Grace instinctively pulled her thin sweater tighter around her shoulders. Without thinking, Ethan removed his wool overcoat and gently offered it to her. She hesitated. You will be cold. I have another one waiting in the car. Then you are luckier than most people. She accepted it with quiet gratitude, slipping her arms into sleeves that were slightly too long. As she did, the silver bracelet inside the wooden box slipped loose and landed softly on the sidewalk. Ethan bent down to pick it up before it could roll into a rain drain. The tiny engraved initials caught the glow of a nearby street lamp. W.H. He carefully placed the bracelet back into her hand. Neither of them realized that this simple piece of silver would soon become the thread connecting two lives that had never been meant to cross, or that the promise Grace believed was dying had already begun changing the heart of the stranger walking beside her. Grace folded Ethan's coat a little tighter around herself as they reached the corner where the quiet cemetery met the busy streets of Manhattan. Evening traffic had begun to thicken, headlights stretching across the rain-soaked pavement like ribbons of gold. For a moment neither of them spoke. It was the comfortable silence of two strangers who somehow no longer felt like strangers. Ethan noticed a small coffee shop across the street with warm lights glowing through fogged windows. Would you let me buy you a cup of coffee? He asked. Grace smiled apologetically. I should probably head home. He nodded. Fair enough. She hesitated before adding, unless you do not mind hearing one more story about Mr. Hayes. Ethan laughed quietly. I have a feeling he was worth listening to. Minutes later they sat beside the front window, each holding a steaming mug while the rain tapped gently against the glass. Grace rested the wooden box beside her chair, never letting it drift far from reach. Mr. Hayes always believed every painting started with one brave brushstroke, she said. He used to tell nervous children that blank paper is only scary until you make the first mark. Ethan looked down at the foam swirling across his coffee. Business is almost the opposite. Everyone spends their lives trying not to make mistakes. Maybe that is why people stop creating beautiful things. Her answer came without judgment, only quiet honesty. Ethan found himself studying her instead of the street outside. She did not speak like someone chasing sympathy. She spoke like someone protecting hope even after disappointment had become familiar. Can I ask you something? He said. Grace nodded. If someone handed you enough money tomorrow to reopen the studio, would you do it? She surprised him by answering immediately. No. Ethan blinked. No? Not unless I earned the right way to do it. She wrapped both hands around the warm cup. Mr. Hayes never taught us that dreams appear because someone rich writes a check. He taught us that dreams survive because ordinary people refuse to quit. Ethan smiled slightly. That sounds incredibly difficult. It is. She laughed. But it also keeps me honest. Before Ethan could answer, his phone vibrated once more across the table where he had absent-mindedly placed it. The screen briefly lit up with dozens of missed calls and a calendar reminder that read International Leadership Gala, 8:30 tonight. Grace glanced away politely. You really are keeping someone waiting. Ethan turned the phone face down without reading another notification. Nothing there is more important than this conversation. She looked genuinely puzzled. You must have a very understanding boss. Ethan almost laughed at the irony. Not always. At that exact moment the coffee shop door swung open. A sharply dressed man hurried inside, scanning the room until his eyes landed on Ethan. Relief immediately crossed his face. There you are, the man said as he approached. Sir, everyone has been trying to reach you. The board members have already arrived, and the press keeps asking when you are making your appearance. Grace looked from the newcomer back to Ethan, confused by the respectful tone. Ethan sighed softly. Daniel, I asked for 1 hour. It has been almost 2. Daniel lowered his voice but could not hide his urgency. Mr. Carter, the gala cannot begin without you. The words seemed to freeze the air between the three of them. Grace slowly turned toward Ethan, her expression shifting from confusion to quiet disbelief. She searched his face as though trying to match it with memories from newspapers she had barely glanced at in grocery store checkout lines. Daniel noticed her surprise and offered a courteous smile. I apologize for interrupting. I am Daniel Brooks, Chief of Staff for Carter Capital. Grace's eyes widened. She looked back at Ethan, then at the simple man who had listened beside a gravestone without mentioning wealth, power, or success. For the first time that evening, she understood that the stranger who had patiently carried part of her sorrow belonged to a world unimaginably different from her own. Grace sat motionless for several seconds, trying to reconcile the kind stranger from the cemetery with the name she had seen on magazine covers and business news broadcasts. Ethan Carter. The billionaire whose companies shaped entire industries. The man reporters described as brilliant, disciplined, and almost impossible to know. Yet the person sitting across from her had never mentioned a single accomplishment. He had simply listened. Daniel checked his watch again, clearly anxious, but Ethan raised a calm hand. Give me 5 more minutes. Daniel hesitated before nodding. Of course, sir. He stepped outside, leaving the coffee shop unusually quiet once again. Grace looked down into her untouched coffee. You knew I would recognize your name eventually. Ethan shook his head. Actually, I hoped you would not. She met his eyes. Why? He smiled, though there was sadness behind it. Because for 1 hour you spoke to me like I was just another person. Grace let out a slow breath. You were. Those 2 simple words caught Ethan completely off guard. Money changes the way people look at me, he admitted. Sometimes before I even say hello. Maybe that is because they think you have all the answers. I definitely do not. Grace studied him for a long moment. Then why did you never tell me who you were? Would you have told me about Mr. Hayes if I had introduced myself as a billionaire? She smiled faintly before shaking her head. Probably not. Exactly. Silence settled between them again, but it no longer felt awkward. It felt honest. Grace reached for the wooden box and rested one hand gently on its worn lid. You asked earlier whether I would reopen the studio if someone simply handed me enough money. Ethan nodded. I have been thinking about that answer. She smiled. Most people think I am stubborn. I think you are protecting something. Grace looked surprised. The dream was never about owning a building, Ethan continued. It was about creating the feeling you had when you walked into Mr. Hayes's classroom. Her eyes softened. Yes. Then perhaps the building is only part of the story. She stared at him thoughtfully. What do you mean? Ethan leaned back slightly. I have spent years building companies by asking the wrong first question. Grace tilted her head. What is the wrong question? How much will it cost? He paused before continuing. The better question is, who will it help? Grace looked down, quietly turning the old brass key between her fingers. Mr. Hayes used to say something similar. He always believed every child carried invisible colors that the world could not see yet. Ethan smiled. I wish someone had reminded me of that years ago. Outside the window, black sedans lined the curb as photographers gathered beneath umbrellas farther down the street, waiting for Ethan's arrival at the gala only a few blocks away. Daniel glanced through the glass, signaling that time was running short. Ethan finally stood. I really do have to go. Grace rose with him and carefully handed back his overcoat. Thank you for lending it to me. He accepted it but noticed she was shivering again in the cool evening air. Keep it until tomorrow. She immediately shook her head. I cannot. Then let me borrow it to you. She laughed softly. Is that your billionaire negotiation strategy? Only when I know I am going to lose. Grace smiled for what felt like the first genuine time that day. Before leaving, Ethan reached into his wallet and removed a simple business card. He placed it on the table without pushing it toward her. If you ever decide you need someone to listen again, call me. Grace looked at the card but made no move to pick it up. I am not looking for charity, Ethan. I know. He smiled warmly. That is exactly why I hope you call. As Ethan followed Daniel toward the waiting cars, he glanced back through the coffee shop window one last time. Grace was still standing beside the table, one hand resting on the wooden box and the other lightly touching the old brass key. Neither of them realized that this quiet goodbye was not an ending at all. It was only the first step in a journey that would lead them to a forgotten place, an unfinished promise, and a discovery capable of changing both of their lives forever. The following morning Ethan arrived at Carter Capital before sunrise, but for the first time in years he walked past the framed awards lining the lobby without noticing them. His thoughts never left the weathered wooden box, the old brass key, and the quiet conviction in Grace's voice when she spoke about children who deserved a place to believe in themselves. During the executive meeting, graphs climbed higher across enormous presentation screens while directors celebrated another record quarter. Applause filled the room. Ethan stared through the glass wall overlooking Manhattan, hearing only fragments of the discussion. Finally one of the board members smiled and asked, Ethan, where should we invest next? He answered almost absent-mindedly. Somewhere that changes a life. The room fell silent. Several executives exchanged puzzled glances, assuming he was speaking metaphorically. Ethan simply closed his notebook and ended the meeting 20 minutes early. Back in his office, he pressed the intercom. Daniel, can you come in? His chief of staff entered carrying a stack of contracts. I already postponed your afternoon interviews because I assumed you wanted time after the gala. Ethan nodded. I need you to help me find someone. Daniel smiled. That should not be difficult. Her name is Grace Bennett. Daniel immediately opened his tablet. Employee? Investor? Client? None of those. Ethan paused before continuing. She teaches part-time art classes at a small community center near St. Matthew Cemetery. Daniel looked mildly surprised but continued typing. Within moments several public records appeared. Grace Bennett. 27. Bachelor of Fine Arts. Freelance illustrator. Community instructor. He hesitated before adding, annual income is modest. Ethan frowned. Close that. Daniel looked confused. Sir? I did not ask how much she earns. Daniel quietly closed the file. Ethan leaned back in his chair. Instead, tell me about the community center. After another search Daniel sighed softly. The building is over 60 years old. Funding has been shrinking for almost a decade. Most children's programs have already been cancelled. Ethan remembered Grace saying she never knew when the next class would happen. Suddenly those words carried far greater weight. Anything else? Daniel scrolled farther down the report before stopping. There is something interesting. Ethan looked up. Go on. The property owner has officially listed the building for sale. Unless someone purchases it within 30 days, the center will permanently close. Ethan stood so quickly that his chair rolled backward. 30 days? Daniel nodded. That appears to be the deadline. Ethan walked toward the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Thousands of people moved through the streets below, each carrying invisible stories just as Grace had described. Somewhere among them children were about to lose the only affordable place where they could paint, imagine, and discover confidence. His reflection stared back from the glass, dressed in an expensive tailored suit that suddenly felt strangely unimportant. Schedule nothing for this afternoon, he said quietly. Daniel blinked. You have dinner with international investors. Cancel it. Tomorrow's television interview? Cancel it too. Daniel had worked beside Ethan for almost 12 years and had never heard him clear his calendar without replacing it with another business commitment. May I ask what we are doing instead? Ethan smiled, though his expression carried unusual determination. We are going to visit a community art center. Daniel could not hide his curiosity. Should I notify the staff that the owner of Carter Capital is coming? Ethan immediately shook his head. No. Why not? Ethan picked up the business card holder from his desk and quietly removed every executive title from the silver case until only his name remained. Because yesterday someone reminded me that the most important conversations begin before people know who you are. An hour later, as a black sedan quietly turned toward the aging brick building where Grace volunteered whenever classes were available, neither Ethan nor Daniel noticed the faded mural painted across one side of the building. Hidden among bright colors and smiling children was a small handwritten signature at the very bottom. Walter Hayes. Grace was standing on a small wooden stool when Ethan quietly stepped inside the community art center later that afternoon. She was carefully taping colorful paper butterflies across a faded bulletin board while half a dozen children laughed around a long paint-covered table. Bright jars of brushes, chipped watercolor trays, and stacks of construction paper filled the room with cheerful disorder. The building itself was tired, but the energy inside it felt wonderfully alive. Grace had not noticed Ethan yet. She was kneeling beside a little boy who stared at a blank sheet of paper with worried eyes. I cannot draw like everyone else, the boy whispered. Grace smiled warmly and placed a tiny blue dot in the center of his page. Now you already have the beginning. The boy frowned. That is only one dot. Every beautiful picture starts with something small. Ethan froze. Those words echoed almost perfectly what she had shared over coffee the night before. He watched as the boy slowly added another dot, then a line, then a bright yellow circle. Within minutes the child was smiling proudly at his own creation. Ethan felt something inside him shift. For years he had measured growth in percentages, quarterly reports, and market value. Grace measured success by the confidence returning to a child's face. Daniel quietly leaned toward him. This room probably costs less to operate for a month than one executive conference. Ethan did not answer. Instead he noticed cracked ceiling tiles, aging heaters, folding chairs repaired with silver tape, and windows that barely closed. The children never seemed to notice any of it. They only noticed Grace. As the afternoon class ended, parents gradually arrived to collect their children. One little girl ran back to hug Grace before leaving. Will you still be here next week? She asked. Grace hesitated for only a heartbeat before smiling. I hope so. The child accepted that answer with innocent confidence and hurried outside. When the room finally grew quiet, Grace turned and saw Ethan standing near the doorway. Genuine surprise spread across her face. You actually came. Ethan smiled. I said I might call. I never said I could not visit. She laughed softly. Fair point. Daniel politely introduced himself before stepping outside to take a phone call, leaving them alone among drying paintings hanging from clotheslines stretched across the room. Grace looked around almost apologetically. It is not much. Ethan slowly shook his head. I think it is more than you realize. She rested one hand on the edge of the paint-stained table. Sometimes I wish Mr. Hayes could see this place. Ethan walked toward the mural covering one wall. Children had added handprints over many years until hundreds of colorful palms formed the branches of a giant painted tree. At the bottom he found the faded signature he had noticed outside. Walter Hayes. He is here, Ethan said quietly. Grace followed his gaze and smiled. He painted the trunk. Every child added another handprint after that. He said no dream grows because of one person alone. Ethan gently touched one small green handprint near the center of the tree. It could not have belonged to anyone older than 5 years old. How many children have come through here? Grace thought for a moment. Probably thousands. And if the building closes? Her smile faded. They lose more than art classes. Ethan nodded slowly. They lose a place where someone believes in them. Grace looked at him with quiet surprise because he had understood what she had been trying to explain since the cemetery. At that moment Daniel stepped back inside carrying an envelope that had just been delivered by overnight courier. Ethan, he said carefully. I think you should see this immediately. Ethan opened the envelope and found official property documents. The community center had received its final notice. Unless the entire purchase price was paid within exactly 28 days, the building would be permanently sold to a commercial developer. Grace closed her eyes for a brief moment, holding the old brass key tightly inside her hand. The promise she had carried for so many years suddenly seemed closer to disappearing than ever before, but Ethan looked at the notice with a calm expression that Grace had not yet learned meant he had already begun searching for a different ending. The news spread through the neighborhood faster than Grace expected. Parents gathered in the hallway after classes, speaking in worried voices while volunteers quietly folded easels and stacked paint supplies as though preparing for an ending no one wanted to accept. The official notice remained taped beside the front entrance, impossible to ignore. 28 days. After that, the building would belong to a developer planning luxury apartments. Grace forced herself to smile for the children, but every time she looked at the countdown her heart grew heavier. Ethan returned 2 days later without photographers, without executives, and without announcing who he was. He carried only a plain notebook beneath one arm. Grace looked surprised when she saw him stepping through the familiar doorway. I thought someone with your schedule would have forgotten this little place by now. Ethan smiled. I have spent years remembering meetings that never mattered. I would rather remember this. They walked slowly through every room together. Grace showed him the tiny supply closet where volunteers stored donated brushes, the leaking ceiling over the pottery shelves, and the old furnace that barely survived each winter. Nothing about the building impressed investors. Everything about it mattered to the people inside. Finally they reached the empty studio where Walter Hayes had painted the enormous handprint tree years earlier. Sunlight streamed through dusty windows, illuminating tiny flecks of dried paint floating gently through the air. Grace rested her hand against the mural. When I was little, I thought this tree would grow forever. Ethan looked closely at the hundreds of colorful handprints. Maybe it still can. She gave him a puzzled look. Ethan opened his notebook. Instead of financial projections, the pages were filled with sketches. New classrooms. Larger windows. Accessible workstations. A reading corner. An outdoor garden where children could paint beneath the trees. Grace stared at the drawings in disbelief. You designed all of this? Ethan nodded. No. You did. She looked confused. I have never seen these before. Every conversation we have shared became part of the design. He turned another page. There was a community gallery where local families could display artwork without paying fees. Another page showed free weekend workshops for veterans, senior citizens, and beginning artists. Then another revealed a scholarship program carrying a simple title: The Walter Hayes Creative Promise. Grace's eyes filled with tears again, but these were different from the tears Ethan had first witnessed in the cemetery. These carried hope instead of surrender. "Ethan," she whispered, "this would cost millions of dollars." "Yes. I cannot let you spend that because of me." He gently closed the notebook. "You still think this is about you?" She looked down quietly. Ethan continued, "You showed me something I forgot a long time ago. Businesses build profits. People build purpose. Those children are not asking for luxury. They are asking for one room where someone believes in them." Grace slowly opened the weathered wooden box she had brought with her. She removed the old brass key and placed it in Ethan's hand. "Mr. Hayes told me this key would open another door someday." Ethan studied the worn metal for a long moment before carefully placing it back into her palm. "No," he said softly. "It belongs to you. You are the one who kept the promise alive long enough for someone else to find it." A week later, the neighborhood gathered outside the community center after receiving invitations that revealed almost nothing except a date and a request to come together. Television crews arrived expecting another corporate announcement from Carter Capital. Instead, they found Ethan standing beside Grace beneath the faded mural. He stepped to the microphone with unusual calm. "Today we are not announcing a new company," he began. "We are protecting an old dream." Then, in front of families, teachers, volunteers, and children holding paint-stained hands, he announced that the building had been purchased, permanently preserved as a non-profit community arts center, and dedicated in honor of Walter Hayes, while naming Grace Bennett its founding director. As applause echoed through the room, Grace quietly slipped the silver bracelet onto her wrist and realized the promise she thought she had failed had finally found its way home. 1 year later, the old brick building no longer looked forgotten. Fresh white paint reflected the morning sunlight, flower boxes overflowed with bright colors, and laughter drifted through open windows before the doors officially opened each day. A polished wooden sign near the entrance welcomed every visitor to the Walter Hayes Creative Promise Center, but beneath the larger letters was a smaller line that Grace insisted be added. "Every dream deserves a first brushstroke." Children hurried inside carrying sketchbooks tucked beneath their arms while parents lingered nearby, smiling as volunteers prepared classrooms filled with music, clay, watercolor, and imagination. The giant handprint tree still covered the studio wall, but hundreds of new handprints had joined the original ones, proving that one act of kindness could continue growing long after the people who started it were gone. Grace walked through the building with the same weathered wooden box she had carried on that rainy evening a year earlier. It now rested inside a glass display near the entrance, beside Walter Hayes's faded photograph, the old brass key, and the folded letter that had once felt too painful to read. The silver bracelet remained on her wrist every single day, quietly reminding her that promises kept with love never truly disappear. She paused beside a classroom where a nervous little girl stared at a blank canvas. Grace smiled and gently placed a single blue dot in the center of the page. "That is enough to begin," she whispered. The little girl smiled exactly as another child had months before. Across the room, Ethan watched without interrupting. His tailored suits had not disappeared, and neither had the responsibilities of leading a global company, but people who worked beside him often remarked that something about him had changed. Meetings ended earlier. Family dinners happened more often. Carter Capital had quietly launched community arts programs in cities across the country, each one built on the same belief that creativity should never depend on someone's income. Reporters frequently asked why one of the most successful businessmen in America had become so passionate about neighborhood art centers. Ethan always gave the same simple answer. "Because the greatest investment I ever made began with listening." That afternoon, the center celebrated its first anniversary. Families filled the courtyard while children's paintings hung from strings stretched between maple trees. No expensive decorations were needed because every colorful drawing told the story better than words ever could. Daniel stood nearby smiling as he watched volunteers greet guests who came from every part of the city. "You know," he quietly said to Ethan, "this project has inspired more people inside the company than any acquisition we have ever completed." Ethan looked toward Grace helping children arrange their artwork. "It was never my project." Daniel laughed softly. "She still does not realize how much she changed you." Ethan smiled. "I do." As the celebration came to an end, the crowd slowly gathered beneath the old oak tree growing beside the center's garden. Grace recognized it immediately. Ethan had chosen a tree that looked remarkably like the one standing inside St. Matthew Cemetery where they first met. He reached into his jacket pocket and removed a small velvet box, but instead of opening it immediately, he gently held out his hand. Grace placed hers inside without hesitation. "1 year ago," he said quietly, "you believed your promise had failed." She shook her head with grateful tears. "Instead it found help." Ethan smiled. "No. It found the person who refused to give up on it." He opened the box, revealing a simple engagement ring whose inner band carried a tiny engraving. "Every beautiful picture starts with something small." Grace covered her mouth as joyful tears filled her eyes. "You remembered." "I always will." She laughed through those tears and nodded before he could even ask the question that both of them already knew the answer to. As friends, families, and children applauded around them, Ethan slipped the ring onto her finger beside the silver bracelet that had started everything. Later that evening, after the last guests had gone home and the lights inside the center glowed softly against the quiet street, Grace looked toward the framed wooden box one final time. The promise had been fulfilled. The dream had become a home for countless others. And the stranger who had once found a young woman crying alone had discovered that the richest life was never measured by what someone owned, but by the hope they helped another person believe was still possible.